This vision, he says, voice ringing like a bell, can never grow in soil watered by injustice. Accountability must come first. Those who have profited from perpetual conflict must answer for the misery they've sown. The global community must stand up, not stand by. As he finishes, the tension in the room has transformed. It's no longer the tension of an argument. It's the tension of a choice waiting to be made. For a brief moment, Traoré's voice carries a note of hope, but behind it lies the steely certainty that if the world fails to choose coexistence, then the spiral of destruction will continue. And this time, no one will be able to claim they didn't know. Silence blankets the chamber, like a storm cloud refusing to break. Traoré's words hang there, alive in every corner, as the delegates squirm in the uncomfortable light of his challenge. Netanyahu's rebuttal sits on the table, but it feels flimsy now, frayed at the edges by the truths that Traoré has laid bare. Cameras swing across rows of delegates. Some whisper behind folded placards. Others stare into the distance, wrestling with a question they can't dodge. How long can they hide behind neutrality when neutrality feeds injustice? Traoré doesn't give them the luxury of retreat. He shifts his aim from one man's policies to the entire world's complicity. He asks them, each representative draped in their nation's colors, what their flags truly stand for. Are they banners of freedom and dignity, or silent witnesses to cruelty they've learned to call complex geopolitics? He speaks now not of Gaza alone, but of history's repeating patterns. Rwanda, where 1 million were butchered while the world held press conferences and drafted statements of concern. Bosnia, where neighbors who once shared coffee were turned against each other, while bureaucrats debated definitions of genocide. Cambodia, where entire generations vanished while global powers bickered over spheres of influence. Every example stabs at the conscience of those seated before him. A mirror reflecting how moral failure, once tolerated, mutates and spreads. His voice is neither loud nor theatrical. It's deliberate, like a judge reading a verdict that cannot be appealed. He reminds them that justice delayed does not stay frozen in the past. It breeds monsters for future. If international law becomes optional for powerful, then every tyrant waiting in the wings will see that impunity is possible, so long as they have the right allies, the right excuses, the right propaganda. Traoré looks up, letting his words travel beyond the gilded chamber and into every home watching this moment unfold. He speaks now to the people, bypassing the leaders who shuffle papers and check their phones to avoid his stare. He calls on citizens, students, activists, those who will inherit the ruins if this cycle doesn't break. History, he says, is not written by speeches alone, but by the actions that follow them. The camera catches a young delegate from a small island nation, eyes wet, whispering to a colleague he's right. Yet Traoré knows words without a plan are just wind. He brings his argument back to the ground with precision. He outlines a path the world could take, one that demands courage. He calls for an independent commission with teeth, not tied hands. He wants open access for humanitarian groups to enter the places politicians prefer to keep in shadow. He proposes trade embargoes that target the machinery of occupation without strangling everyday people. He demands a freezing of funds that fuel settlement expansions, the rerouting of aid to rebuild schools, hospitals, homes. Some ambassadors shift uncomfortably. They know these measures bite. Traoré doesn't flinch. He says plainly, if accountability feels like an attack, then you've aligned yourself with injustice. Stand with peace, and accountability becomes your shield. The message is piercing. It's not vengeance he seeks. It's a moral reset, a chance to choose the side of children over the side of bombs. He closes a chapter not with anger, but with an unexpected grace. He speaks of his own country's scars, how the people of Burkina Faso know the sting of being overlooked, how solidarity is not just a word, but a force that once turned back the darkness. He holds up this truth as a promise, that even the smallest nation, the quietest voice, can spark a reckoning when it dares to say what others fear. As his final words echo off the stone walls, a hush falls that is deeper than before. This is not the silence of dismissal. It is the silence of people who know they've been called out, stripped of excuses, left with only a choice that history will remember. Somewhere in that hush, a new possibility breathes, fragile but alive. Silence stretches across the UN hall, like a wound that no one wants to touch. The world watches through flickering screens. Millions of eyes, millions of minds grappling with the tremor that Ibrahim Traoré's words have set in motion. Some delegates scribble frantic notes. Others lean back, weighed down by the undeniable truth. The old excuses no longer hold. But Traoré isn't finished. He knows this moment demands more than a speech. He shifts forward, his voice now calm, almost gentle, the calm of someone who knows the storm is already here. He opens a folder, thin but heavy with revelations that pierce diplomatic shields like arrows. He begins to read testimonies. Families forced from ancestral homes overnight. Farmers watching their wells poisoned, their crops flattened by bulldozers. Teachers standing in schools that become rubble before the day's first lesson can end. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't soften it for the cameras. The world must see what it has ignored. Then he drops what no one expected. Declassified satellite images, signed directives, financial trails that lead straight to the architects of the settlements, the back channels that funnel aid meant for rebuilding into expansion projects that bulldoze hope instead. It's not a rumor now. It's proof. And in that proof is a warning far sharper than any threat. He fixes his gaze on the rows of powerful states whose money and silence make this cycle possible. This, he says, voice steady as stone, is not just Netanyahu's legacy. This is yours too if you do nothing. His words slice the air. In boardrooms across the world, advisors lean toward their screens, realizing that this is no longer a local issue that can be swept under press releases and political spin. It's global now, raw, exposed, undeniable. But in the same breath, Traoré offers a bridge. He calls for an independent international tribunal. Not a symbolic hearing, but a real reckoning with subpoena power, funding to protect witnesses, and transparency so the world can see every step. He demands an immediate freeze on settlement expansions, monitored by neutral observers. He proposes a reparations fund, seated by the very nations that have propped up the occupation for decades. It's a roadmap for accountability, not vengeance, but justice that plants seeds of real peace. Then, with a voice that trembles just slightly, a crack that makes him more human, more real, Traoré shares a vision that stands in stark contrast to the horrors he's laid bare. He asks the hall to imagine a child in Gaza waking up not to sirens, but to sunlight spilling through an intact roof. He asks him to see an Israeli child who never learns the sound of an air raid shelter. He paints a future of two people standing side by side in markets, in classrooms, in playgrounds that echo with laughter instead of drones. For a heartbeat, he lets that vision linger, a fragile possibility that feels more powerful than any weapon. He leans in for his final words, lowering his voice, so the world has to lean in too. History will not ask if you were comfortable when you heard these truths. It will ask what you did next. Did you stand up or did you stand by? He pauses, one heartbeat too, eyes locked on the cameras that will carry his words to every corner of the earth. As he steps back from the podium, the room is so quiet it feels like the whole world is holding its breath. There is no applause at first, only the thunderous silence of people realizing they just witnessed a line drawn in the sand that cannot be ignored. Outside, news outlets scramble to push the story live. Inside, some leaders sit frozen, knowing this moment will chase them into every summit, every interview, every vote they cast. Ibrahim Traoré turns, walks away from the podium, his footsteps echoing across marble and memory alike. He came not just to speak, but to deliver a brutal warning wrapped in a fragile promise. The future will judge whether the world finally chose courage over complicity. And somewhere, far beyond the cold lights of the UN chamber, millions watch and wonder what they will choose too. They say the wind carries whispers that even the most guarded walls can't keep out. On a rainy dawn in Ouagadougou, no one expected a young woman in tattered clothes to stand outside the presidential gates, soaked to the bone, clutching nothing but a battered notebook. Yet behind those rags was a warning so raw, so unthinkable, it would soon shake the very soul of a nation and test the resolve of Ibrahim Traoré like never before. The guards at first laugh her off, dismissing her as just another desperate beggar. But there was something in her eyes, a haunting mix of fear and unyielding fire. She refused to leave. For hours she waited, shivering under the drizzle, eyes fixed on the heavy iron gates that separated her from the one man she believed could stop the coming storm. When they finally dragged her into a side room, she clutched her notebook to her chest like it was her last breath. The officials tried to pry it from her hands, but she cried out, not in fear for herself, but for what she carried inside those pages. It was a list, names, dates, transactions, a paper trail of betrayal that snaked through back alleys and boardrooms, right up to men who smiled in front of cameras while plunging knives behind the backs of their own people. When word reached Traoré's inner circle, the room fell into uneasy silence. Who was she? How did she come by such dangerous secrets? And what would it mean if even half of what she claimed was true? It didn't take long for Traoré himself to hear about the girl in rags who spoke of shadows in high places. Many expected him to ignore her, another distraction in a world already full of fires to put out. But Ibrahim Traoré was not a man to turn away from the uncomfortable truths that others buried. He ordered to meet her in person, a decision that would test not only his courage, but his faith in the people he trusted most. When she entered the room, the air crackled with something heavy. Not fear, but fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would finally listen. She knelt before him, hands trembling as she offered him the notebook. Traoré didn't flinch at her filthy clothes or the streaks of mud across her skin. He asked her to stand. He asked her to speak. And speak she did. Her voice wavered at first, but as she unraveled her story, the truth poured out like a flood that had been dammed for too long. She spoke of secret deals to siphon gold reserves, backroom meetings with foreign agents promising riches in exchange for silence. She spoke of farmers driven from their land, villages torched under the guise of progress. Children left to starve while those at the top feasted. Traoré listened. Not once did he interrupt. His eyes never left hers, even when the weight of her words pulled the room into a darkness no flickering bulb could chase away. For the first time in years, the girl felt seen, not as a peasant, not as a nuisance, but as a voice that mattered. When she finished, silence filled the room like a hell breath. Traoré took the notebook in his hands, its pages damp and smudged, but the message clear as day. Trust was rotting from within. His nation was bleeding from wounds hidden behind polished speeches and stage photos. He could have dismissed her. He could have ordered her removed, her words buried, her face forgotten. But instead, he did something that would ripple far beyond that quiet office. He asked her one simple question: "Will you stand with me?" In that moment, the girl in rags became more than just a messenger. She became a spark, one that would ignite whispers into roars, shadows into light. And as dawn broke over Ouagadougou, the story of the girl who walked in rags to warn Traoré Ibrahim had only just begun. The days that followed were unlike anything the young woman could have imagined. She was given a room, plain but warm, inside a guarded compound where whispers of her story raced faster than the wind. Some called her a liar, others called her a hero, but only Traoré knew the truth she carried. And he kept her close, not as a prisoner, but as a witness to a storm he was preparing to face head-on. Behind closed doors, Traoré pored over every page of her battered notebook. Each name, each coded account, each scribbled note was a blade pointing to betrayal. Some of those names belonged to men he had dined with, laughed with, trusted like brothers in the struggle for a free and honest Burkina Faso. Now, those same men sat in air-conditioned boardrooms, plotting to sell the nation's soul for a handful of dollars in foreign favors. He did not sleep much that week. The woman, whose name was Safi, often found him alone at his desk, eyes red but mind sharp as steel. Sometimes he'd ask her to tell the story again, each retelling adding more fragments to the puzzle he was determined to solve. Each time, she'd see the lines on his face deepen, not with fear, but with the weight of knowing what had to come next. Outside, rumors spread like wildfire. People spoke of a girl in rags who carried a death list. Some said she was an agent of chaos, sent to tear the nation apart. Others whispered she was a sign that the old ways were dying, that the days of fat men stealing futures in smoke-filled rooms were numbered. One night, a knock rattled Safi's door. It was Traoré himself, alone, carrying 2 steaming mugs of ginger tea. He sat beside her on the small bed, his eyes searching hers for something she still couldn't name. They talked, not about the notebook, not about the traitors, but about her life before all this. She spoke of the village she once called home, Fields of millet that fed family for generations, now swallowed by the greed of men who'd never set foot on that soil. She spoke of her father, who died defending his land, and her mother, who taught her to read the world to the lines of people's faces. By the time dawn crept through the window, they were no longer just a president and a peasant girl. They were two souls bound by the same wound, a love for a country that deserved better. The next day, Traoré called a private meeting with his most trusted aides. Safi stood behind him, silent but fierce, as they laid out the evidence piece by piece. Names were read aloud. Some gasped, some lowered their eyes in shame. There were arguments, shouts, threats of ruin if any of this ever reached the public. But Traoré's voice cut through it all like a blade. We have been betrayed from within, but we will not fight this in shadows. We will bring the truth to light, and we will let the people decide who stand with us. Safi watched as powerful men shrank under the weight of their own secrets. She felt no pity for them. She remembered the hungry children, the burned huts, the mothers who buried sons, so these men could line their pockets. The truth was not a burden to her. It was a gift, a weapon more powerful than any gun. Word leaked before the sun even set. In the markets and the schools, on the dusty roads, and under the shade of mango trees, people spoke of a reckoning. Some wept at the thought of trusted leaders exposed as traitors. Others clenched fists, ready to defend what little they still had left. Safi knew this was only the beginning. She stayed awake that night, sitting by her small window, listening to the heartbeat of a nation that had been shaken awake by her story. She wondered if she'd live to see what would come next. She wondered if Traoré truly understood how far his enemies would go to silence the truth.